Looking at motherboards is always a blast. This time we're looking at, based on a subscriber question, a particular high-end desktop motherboard from ASUS. And the TRX40 is one of my favorite chipsets. Let's read the comment for our video title, and that'll give us the name based on this particular motherboard. By the way, we may have a potential problem as we zoom in and zoom out, because I'm also going to take a look at this as we look at the specs on this motherboard that I'm going to tell you about in a minute, as it relates to the one we've been talking about, because again, the zooming in and zooming out is really important as we look at the timeline, problem, solution, the what, why, and how, where we're at, what we need to be doing, and where we've come from. I think all this is relevant. The comment. Now this comment is on the video about the ASUS ProArt Z490 Creator 10G Thunderbolt 3 motherboard and a by 16 M.2 NVMe quad card. Scrolling down and zooming in, this is from Brainstorm. Need advice? What do you think of the motherboard ASUS ROG Strix TRX40 gaming? I forgot what CPU you recommended with this motherboard. Thank you. Sorry for the bother, but you're the best in this. I'm honored. Privilege. My first comment. Well, Brainstorm, welcome. Prefer a video response on this, which will help more subscribers. Great question. I'm honored. Give me a couple of days. And that's where we are right now. I find these motherboards absolutely fascinating, and I appreciate the question, and I appreciate the comment. Okay, what we need to do, look at the motherboard, take a look at our options for CPUs. I want to zoom in on this motherboard and look at how resources are allocated, because every motherboard is different. No matter how much I love the chipset, this one especially, there's things I like about it. There's some things that are like, but let's see how this all works out. So let's go check out the motherboard. First thing we'll do is go to ASUS. Let's go to support. We're not going to go to tech specs. We're going to go straight to support. We're looking for the manual. We need to double check what we have in manuals. Sometimes there's as many as 5. We see a user's manual and that's it. Great, that'll simplify life. Okay, we're going to download the manual. We'll do a search for specification. First thing I look for is a diagram, which I don't see, but always look for it. Sometimes we get it, most of the time we don't. So we have specification. We will have a motherboard layout. I want to look at that. To reiterate, we want to look at the CPU lanes and how those PCI Express lane resources are allocated, and then we want to look at the chipset lanes and see how those PCI Express resources are allocated. It's always different. It's always fascinating. First thing I want to mention, there is no support, which means native Thunderbolt 3 BIOS support on this motherboard. So whether that's a plus or a minus, I'll mention that out there. For those that have experience with Thunderbolt, I'm interested in hearing what you say. For those that are giving me an opinion based on what they've read, nothing beats experience. So Thunderbolt was the first thing I want to get that out of the way. Let's see what else we've got, what we like, what we don't like. So let's look at the motherboard layout first. That says 1.2, which is actually page 18. Beautiful motherboard, 8 DIMMs, so we can support up to 256 gigs. We'll go back and verify that. We have 3 PCI Express by 16 slots mechanically and electrically, PCI Express by 16 _1, 2, and 3. And then we have another little slot down here, PCI Express by 4, which is 4 lanes. And wow, look at the SATA ports, 2, 4, 6, 8, which means that's 8 lanes, chipset lanes. We have an M.2 _1, M.2 _2, and there should be, right up here, an M.2 _3. Sticks up off the motherboard, which is kind of fascinating. In some ways, it makes it easier to put a heat sink on it because it's not in the way of everything else. But another way, because it sticks up away from everything, it's going to have or should have better air circulation. So point that out. So let's go back to our specification summary. This takes us to page 9. Let's zoom in on that, top down. And it's good to point out and remember this is a 3rd generation Threadripper 3. I know that name is redundant, but I want to point that out. TRX40 chipset, love it. DDR4 3200 is a safe spot. This can be overclocked to a DDR4 4400, depending on the memory you've got and what you're using. And again, it'll take up to 256 gigs, which we have done, which is amazing. Why that's important, we've come so far so fast. We weren't able to go with a lot of RAM until we hit Windows Vista. Windows Vista 64-bit. And when we went from 4 gig to 8 gig, that was a big deal. And with the previous generation on the Threadripper 2nd generation, which was a Threadripper 2, on the X399 chipset, which was PCI Express 3, we got up to, I believe, 128 gigs of RAM. So now we're up to 256. And then the next platform leap that we're going to talk just a little bit about as we look at the zoom in and zoom out, we can go up to 512 gigs of RAM, which is phenomenal. Even though the motherboard says it'll support 2 terabytes affordably, that supports on that platform, which is the WRX80 512. So it's significant to see the jumps and how we've leaped and how quickly it's happened. Okay, this platform now has been out about 2 years. I want to point that out. And it's still a good platform to be on if you can find it. Here's what we want to know. Expansion slots, we have 3 PCI Express plus 16 mechanically and electrically, which is phenomenal. And then we have that last one right there through the chipset, PCI Express before. And we'll address what we might put in those slots. So the question about what do we think of it? Well, let's get through all the resources. M.2_1 and M.2_2, just like this motherboard that I'm going to show you as a comparison, which is the Gigabit TRX40 Designaire. We have 2 M.2 connectors to the CPU. And I always like to point that out. Now, one of them is underneath this video card. And yes, this is a very wide video card because there's one slot here that you can't see that's just barely sticking out that I can't use right now with that GPU. And this happens to be an EVGA RTX 3080. Again, to reiterate, one M.2, the other M.2, underneath the GPU, those are to the CPU. And the other 2, through this one long heatsink, those are through the chipset. And on this motherboard, M.2_3 is through the chipset. So let's go back to the motherboard layout. And M.2_1 and M.2_2, those 2 are direct to the CPU. And this M.2_3 right up here, that is through the chipset. So a little bit slower if you're using all 3 of them together. Only matters, like, say, if they were in RAID. So I wouldn't necessarily RAID those 3 together. Unlike this board that has 2 16-lane slots and 2 8-lane slots, because all 3 of these 16-lane slots are to the CPU, you have, let's say, 3 options. Option number 1, 1 GPU, 2 quad cards. Option number 2, 2 GPUs, 1 quad card. And option number 3 would be 3 GPUs because you have 3 16-lane slots. So those are 3 options. Now, because of the spacing and the way that's allocated, slot number 3, or excuse me, PCI Express plus 16_3 based on the width. Actually, PCI Express plus 16_2 and PCI Express plus 16_3 are both going to be a little tight for space because of the spacing. If you'll notice down here for PCI Express by 4, that 4-lane slot. Now up here, we've got a good amount of space. That looks like we can probably put in that first slot based on the width of this, because this is a little over 2¼ slots wide, but it's wide enough, it's thick enough that I can't get to that slot that's right there, right at it. Now, if I change this from an RTX 3080 to, say, an EVGA RTX 2080 Ti, which is only 2 slots wide, it fits. It fits, and I can get to that first 8-lane slot. So if we look at the spacing on this motherboard, based on what it looks like you've got, knowing the width of an M.2 connector, I would say you've probably got enough space there, which would be from here to here, for an RTX 3090, which would be about 3½ slots wide. That looks like that will fit, which is phenomenal. Now, again, servers, workstations, high-end desktop, everything's below that. Now, this is on the platform for the TRX40, which is one of my favorite chipsets, has been for 2 years. I think probably you're going to have, and I had hoped this might be a 10-year platform, but the way I look at it right now, we've had this for a couple of years. So, and I don't know what you got for a source for a motherboard. One thing I would say is I would not buy a used motherboard based on the technology for a couple of reasons. It could be the CPU, could be for the memory, because if any of the pins are bent, you got a problem. And we've had some users who have done that, who have had troubles with their motherboard. Now, you can have trouble with a new motherboard. We've had that as well. You can also have trouble with a new CPU. We've had that as well. A gentleman in South America, he went through 2 motherboards. Wasn't the motherboard. Manufacturer thought it was a motherboard. I thought it was a motherboard. He did too. Anyway, finally figured out it was the CPU, and that was a nightmare getting that handled into South America, but he did. I believe he's in Colombia. But anyway, I remember what we went through trying to get that working. Stuff can happen. So I would be very careful about buying a used motherboard. Now, there are some links I can put up where there are some people that still have a TRX40 motherboard, maybe not specifically this one, because we're going to take a look at PC Part Expo. That's part of the zooming in and zooming out. As we look at this motherboard, as the way the resources are allocated, it's realistic to expect, for example, if I put say, an ATI video card in here that's only 2 slots wide, I could do the same thing on that board, and I can get 3 GPUs in there. Because if they're only 2 slots wide, not that I would, but I could, you could put one really nice beefy GPU. You could put 2 quad cards in here because the quad cards are only 2 slots wide. And I intentionally left the quad card out of this machine because this 16-lane slot, to show you how tight we are and to show you where this 16-lane slot rests, when I put the quad card in there, it comes right up against the Thunderbolt card. So I've got space as long as I size everything accordingly. Now the biggest video card I could put in here, 2 slots wide with the most amount of memory, would probably be the ATI, which I believe has 32 gigs of RAM. However, if our number one requirement were CUDA cores, then I'm looking at, for this build, and this is relevant even though you didn't ask, then I would probably looking at, say, like an RTX A series, and based on the CPU cores, based on the RAM for the Adobe After Effects multi-frame rendering CPU optimization formula. The best use of that space for a GPU in this particular computer, which could apply to yours depending on where you're at, would be like an RTX A5000. It would get me at a point that would satisfy my needs for amount of RAM, amount of processing power that I'm going to get, the amount of power that's going to be required for the power supply I've got in here, and I've still got room for everything else. On this, I like this layout. I like these 3 16-lane slots, and I like the fact that that one 4-lane slot, for example, if I had the chance to change this motherboard, the Gigabit TRX40 Designaire, I would want this motherboard set up like that motherboard. However, I always talk about, list 5 things and prioritize those 5 things. You change that priority, change that one thing, changes everything. Well, this is a good example. I would rather have my slots set up that way with 3 16-lane slots and one 4-lane slot, because based on the way I'm using this, with 2 16-lane slots and 2 8-lane slots, I'd rather have 3 16-lane slots where I could get a GPU, a couple of quad cards, and I only need 4 lanes for Thunderbolt 3. And this is the Gigabyte Titan Ridge Thunderbolt 3. And this happens to be revision 1 with all the firmware updates. But because I'm in an 8-lane slot, I'm only using 4 lanes, I lose 4 lanes, which is kind of a bummer. But again, about the issue of priority. The priority for me, for building this machine, was Thunderbolt 3. So to get BIOS support for Thunderbolt 3 on the TRX40, this was it. So I had to accept one little shortcoming. But it's not that big a deal. It's just those 4 lanes I can't do anything with, which is kind of a bummer. Where on this board, you don't lose any lanes, but you can't use Thunderbolt 3 on that motherboard to have BIOS support. And again, BIOS support's important. As far as the 3 M.2 drives, 2 on the motherboard, which is a great place to be, for the CPU, and that 3rd one through the chipset, that's fine. Now, any that you put on a quad card, like in this machine, because it's going to be on PCI Express lanes to the CPU, they're going to be as fast as the ones on the motherboard. So the prioritization is M.2 drives on the motherboard are the fastest. The second fastest will be the ones that are plugged into a PCI Express slot on a quad card. And then the third will be any that are through the chipset. And you've only got 1 through the chipset. So if you're setting this up for content creation, you're probably going to be using 3 drives. Your primary drive for your boot drive, your secondary drive for your, could be your applications. Then if you put a quad card on there, that could be your scratch drive. And then you could have another drive, which would be a spinning drive, because my gosh, you've got 2, 4, 6, 8 SATA ports, which is 8 PCI Express lanes through the chipset. Anyway, I would like to put probably at least 2 of those on a hot swap, so you can have an internal, like we've got in this case, spinning drive, like we have allocated over here. But I've also got, on the front of this case, a removable bay right here, where I can either plug in a 3.5 inch or a 2.5 inch that takes up 1 slot. And I've got an open bay for some other stuff I've been messing with. I've been looking at some more SATA ports, but that's another topic. I think we got too many SATA ports on the motherboard. I wish they would reallocate those, but I wanted to show you this. I like options for an internal drive, but I like options for an external drive, spinning drive, so that I can pop those in and out. But I wanted to show you that as a possibility that you can do with this motherboard. We are all about options. So again, to reiterate, what do I think of the motherboard? I like it. There's only one thing I don't like, which is the Thunderbolt. Now, I think we need to take another perspective on this. I want to go to, well, let me show you. Let's go to PCPartPicker. Now, I've already picked out a couple of components, and that is the motherboard that you're looking at, and also with the CPU we recommend, which was the 3970. And at this point, looking at the totals, I want to show you some of what I'm getting ready to show you. I can only show you on PCPartPicker System Builder because it's easy. The other part I'm going to have to tell you about and show you, but it's going to be a little bit more information through a search. So let's look at this. I'm going to clean this out. You'll understand once I get through. I'm going to go to System Builder. I'm going to choose a motherboard based on the chipset, and I think it'll become clear once I do this. You'll understand what we're looking at, what we're doing. Based on the AMD TRX40. Now, this says we have 14 compatible products. We're looking at all the brands, everybody that's available. Of the motherboards that are available, of this list, and yes, I can go out and I can do a search, and I can hunt and peck, and I can find the motherboard that you've got that you're looking at. But I've only got 2 that are showing a price. And based on what the price of those are, I want to drill down now and look at ASUS based on what you're talking about, of which there have been 5 motherboards. Not a one of those is showing available. And the motherboard we're looking at is the ROG Strix, here at the bottom of the list, TRX40 E-Gaming. I'll add that to the list. Now, the point of that is, one, to show you how many motherboards have been available. We're talking 2 years now in this time frame. But how many are showing that are available with a price? We saw 2, and I can find others. In fact, I found one for a digital audio workstation from a company I've never heard of, but I'll, now that I've mentioned it, put a link up that if you're interested in that, looks like a phenomenal machine that they're willing to build. I believe they're in Florida. They claim they've got stock on this, which is phenomenal. And I think, I'm not 100%, but I think they've got your motherboard. So number 1, I'm focused on the chipset. Number 2, I'm looking at the motherboard. But number 3, I'm looking at availability. Okay, let's look at the CPU. That too is also telling. So we'll choose a CPU, and it already predefines the list for us, of which we have 3 CPUs, a 3990X, a 3970, and the 3960. I think at the time, based on what you get, bang for the buck, the 3970 was the best deal for the money. 32 cores and 64 threads. That was a good deal. However, at this point in time, 2 years out, we've probably got about 3 years left on this platform. So if somebody built this like I did, thinking that it was going to be a 10-year machine, it's looking like it might have been a 5 to 7 year machine. So let's look at the price on this based on where we're at. Because one is the figuring out what you want, and the clocks on these look good. The performance clock, 3.7. The boost clock is at 4.5. And price-wise, you get a gist of an idea of what we're looking at in terms of dollar amount. We think of this when you're building a high-end desktop or you're building a workstation, and that's really where I'm headed with this, that it's a matter of not just how much it's going to cost, but how much work is it going to do, because we're looking at a purpose-built computer. Now, I don't know how you're going to use this, but based on what we do, the reason you came to us, we look at motherboards, and we like to look at the PCI Express resources, what we can plug into that motherboard after we build it, when we get ready to do upgrades, because it's always been about how can I upgrade that machine to improve performance, to increase longevity for whatever work I'm doing. So now we focus on rendering. And some of the render engines that will support multiple GPUs. I thought 8 was a lot. One of you came to me with another one that we may do a video about that'll support up to 40 GPUs. But there are some gotchas on that, which I'll get into in another video. But the point of it is, it still is about the primary GPU. So as we build a machine that we want to upgrade, what options do we have for upgrading? We're limited. If this was intended to be a 10-year machine, like on that chipset, and the last one we built, I had another client that I built locally for on this platform. He was considering something low end, and I showed him the options, and he said, well, I'm going to stretch it and build this. I said, well, I think you've done right. You got at least an 8-year machine. I was hoping it was going to be a 10-year machine, but based on what I'm seeing now in availability, I don't know what AMD is doing, but if you can't get a motherboard and the processor, well, let's compare. We're not done yet, because I want to make a case for what I think you need to look at, not just focus on the motherboard and the processor, but we need to do the what if. So if so far we've looked at this particular item, and we're looking at a total price on this of $3,500 for these 2 items, but we only have a price on the processor, that's a 3970. I want to keep it simple. So let's do a search for a 3975WX, and we should be looking at, I'll go to the one here on Amazon. I know there's going to be some sticker shock. Yeah, see, these prices are too high right now for this processor, the 3975. My point is, compare the two technologies, the TRX40 versus the WRX80. It's a lot easier to justify if you're going to spend $600 or $700 on a motherboard to go from a TRX40 that gives you those 3 16-lane slots and that one 4-lane slot to get a WRX80. The problem is right now the CPUs. So if you're building now, if you're going to build in, say, maybe about 6 months, and if you're looking to build down the road, maybe in about a year, I still think the WRX80 is a better deal than this. This was a good value, to reiterate, 2 years ago. But if you can get your hands on that motherboard right now, you're spending $500 or $600. Let's take a look at the motherboard. I always like to start with AMD on the WRX80 because the next video we're going to do is going to be specifically about a workstation based on another question we've got where someone says, I want a lot of lanes. Now, right now, suffice to say, 3 boards are listed. There's actually 7 motherboards that we're aware of that I'm going to get into that in the next video. But the point I want to mention, if we look at a specific motherboard, I'll go back over to Amazon and show you. One of the easiest motherboards to find still right now on the WRX80 is the ASUS motherboard. Plenty of those in stock. And if you notice all those slots, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So what you get are 7 16-lane slots mechanically. Electrically, you'll probably get 6 16-lane slots electrically, and one of those 16-lane slots will be an 8-lane slot electrically, which is still pretty good. And based on the spacing, you're going to want to use an RTX A series GPU. So even though I think you're spending too much money right now for that processor, I think you have to stop and think and evaluate, do I build now? Do I build in 6 months? The really point of that is we're all waiting on the WRX80 for a CPU. We've had the 3000 series CPU. Okay, the Threadripper Pro that works on the WRX80 is first generation on the 3000 series. That's what we're monkeying around with on the CPUs. We'll take a look at AMD in here in just a second. But the 5000 series processor that's been announced several months ago is still not available. It's supposed to come out with Lenovo first, whatever that's about. I don't get it. But we're waiting on those processors once they get through Lenovo's hands to get into everybody else's hands. And those processors are going to be a big deal, and I'm expecting some more motherboards. Some of the motherboards I've mentioned, of which there are 7 we are aware of, not all of them are available yet. Another one that's supposed to be able to be rack mounted from Gigabit is available, that I'm going to get into more in the next video. But I wanted to share this with you and give this to you as an option. And that option being, do you build on the TRX40? What do I think of the motherboard? I love it. If you can get your hands on one, don't buy used. Buy a new one. But the price of the processor is ridiculous. And let's go back and look at that one more time. From System Builder, if I kick that loose, and we look again at the 3 CPUs available, the top CPU, which is a 3990, is a ridiculous price right now. I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole, because if you're looking at that kind of money, you're better off, instead of paying too much money for that CPU, you're better off buying a Threadripper Pro and paying too much money for that CPU, because it's more resources, more bang for the buck. But again, to reiterate, of the 3 in the class, the one in the middle is the one that I recommend. And going forward, let's see how this compares. And I like this real quick and easy. 24, 32, and 64. So what are our options with the Threadripper Pro? I find it ironic right now that AMD is only showing in this list, as you drill down, the 5000 series CPUs on the Threadripper Pro, which right now are still vaporware. They don't exist. Let me rephrase that. They do exist for those that have been big enough, some of the studios, that have had access to them and have, or it looks like over a year, maybe 2 years, to work with one of these CPUs. And they love them. They think they're phenomenal. So the rest of us are foaming at the mouth, waiting to be thrown a bone. Let me see if I can find those 3000 series CPUs. Probably the easiest way now to look at all of the Threadripper Pro chips is to go to Lenovo and look at the ThinkStation P620. And I still think this is relevant to our discussion. Okay, we can see from Lenovo that there were 4 CPUs. The 3945 on the left, which this is the only way you can get that low-end CPU. Then you got the 3955, the 3975, and the 3995. And based on 12 cores, 24 threads, 16 cores, 32 threads, 32 cores, 64 threads, and then 64 cores, 128 threads. I think the one that is the best bang for the buck on the Threadripper Pro is the 3975. I'm only showing you this for the technology, not the price, because if I compare, and I've done it before where I put Lenovo side by side with, say, Supermicro. Supermicro is a better box, but this is just easy to compare. And I also want to double check and see if there's anything I could find on the 5000 series Threadripper Pro yet, but I cannot. So I wanted to make the distinction for you on the machine that you're asking me about, that you're asking about a TRX40. What do I think of the motherboard? I love it. It's amazing. If you had built it past, but my concern and my question is building it going forward, getting your hands on a new motherboard, not a used one, and getting your hands on a CPU at a fair price. Because based on the numbers, and I'll put some links up into, well, let me show you something else right quick. If we were to go to, say, B&H, photo video, and let's do a search just on the TRX40, which is a kind of ironic what they put in the list. Anyway, the purpose of this, now that's strange because I did this today earlier, and it showed out of stock. Oh, here it is. Okay, out of stock. There's a Gigabit TRX40, discontinued. Here's another Gigabit TRX40 discontinued, another Gigabit TRX40 discontinued, another one discontinued, and they're not even showing the ASUS, which I'm really surprised now. My point of that was to show you for the TRX40, be careful of your source, because if we go to Newegg and do that same search, you're getting a board that'll be coming from China or Taiwan. I'd be careful about that. So I wanted to point that out. You want to get a new motherboard, but be careful who the source is. And the audio outfit I told you about. Okay, this is an ADK Pro Audio. I believe they're in Florida, and this is one box that they can build, and I'll put a link up to this for a digital audio workstation. Doing searches for technology on different devices yields different results. They're never the same. So I search on one device, I find certain information. I search on another device. It's like just even doing these videos. I will look at these and preview them on a phone, on a computer, and on a large screen because I like to see they look different depending on what's going on. And some of the other stuff that I need to do, I'm working on. But anyway, suffice to say, this is one company that looks like they could build a digital audio workstation, and based on the configuration, you can go through the specs and see if that's something you want to do. The reason I share this because it's always a question of do I build it or do I buy it? But right now the question is, where can I get it from? Who's got it? Who's got it in stock? So we're having to do some hunting and pecking. I also found GoVets that has a motherboard on the TRX40. I'll put a link up. And I want to thank you guys for supporting us with the affiliate links that we use because it helps to keep things going. And I found, I believe it was XOTIC PC. I'll check the spelling on that. I believe they also could build a TRX40 liquid cooled, which I found kind of fascinating. So I hope this helps. To answer your question about this particular motherboard, nice. 3 PCI Express by 16 slots electrically to the CPU and 1 PCI Express before slot through the chipset. Now for that PCI Express before slot, you could use a capture card. A 1080 capture card internal would be 1 lane, 1 slot, whereas if you put a 4K capture card in there, it's probably going to be 4 lanes. So it would work in that 4-lane slot. Or you might have some other I/O card you want to put in there, but you have to think about how many lanes it needs, what's required. Thunderbolt would have been nice on that board, but without motherboard support to the BIOS, why they chose not to, I don't know. The SATA ports are nice. I like that, 2, 4, 6, 8, but that's 8 PCI Express lanes. So good motherboard. I like the options. That's what I think of it. But think about what you're looking at. Look at the possibilities because you don't want to sell yourself short of what you might be better off building. Now, in the next video, we're going to get more into this where someone said, I want a computer, and I'll say what we're building it for, with a lot of PCI Express lanes that they're going to be doing media stuff with. So this is a good machine, been a good machine. That will be a good machine. Longevity of it, I would say you'll get probably another 3 years out. It's been out 2 years. But I don't know if it's worth what it's going to cost because I think you're better off saving that and building above it for a workstation based on WRX80. So I hope this helps. I want to do a video. My name is GuildBoy. This is BuildOrBuy. Welcome. Look forward to seeing you next video. We're out.